Hi, this is Mr. Sleepless Horror. Listen to horror stories to fall asleep to with rain sounds. I still remember the morning it happened, because even now when I think back on it my mind pulls up the same image first. The trailhead sign at the edge of the San Juan National Forest was half rotted, leaning to one side, and the wood had this strange gray tone that made it look like it had been submerged underwater for years. I remember brushing my hand over it as if that simple touch would anchor me before the long trek ahead, but all it did was leave a thin trace of splintered dust on my palm. I should have taken that as the first warning, but back then I was too eager to get away from everything that had been weighing me down. I wanted silence, a long trail, and the feeling of disappearing into the trees. I thought the forest would give me that. I had no idea how wrong I was. The trail started easy, weaving through tall ponderosa pines that shed long needles like loose threads across the ground. The air smelled dry and warm, and I could hear the distant trickle of a creek hidden somewhere to my right. Everything felt calm, predictable, and almost soothing in a way only remote places can offer. But that sense of peace didn't last. I started noticing small things out of place, things that didn't align with what I'd seen in these forests before. The first was a line of old boot prints pressed into the trail dust, but they weren't fresh. They were deep, as if whoever made them carried something extremely heavy, and each print was spaced far apart, longer than a normal stride. I followed them for nearly half a mile before they abruptly vanished where the path curved. I tried to shake off the unease by telling myself they simply faded into harder ground, but something about the way they stopped made it feel intentional, like the person had stepped off the trail with a purpose. I finally reached a clearing in the late afternoon. I had planned to camp there, and at first glance it looked perfect. Flat ground, open sky, soft pine litter underfoot. But the longer I stood there, the more I noticed the stillness. No insects, no birds, no distant rustling of branches. It was the kind of silence that felt constructed, like everything was holding its breath. I set up camp anyway because the sun was already sinking behind the ridge, and I didn't want to move through unfamiliar terrain in the dark. I cooked, ate, settled into my tent, and tried to convince myself that the quiet was just a feature of the elevation. But sleep didn't come easily. Sometime past midnight I woke up without knowing why. The air inside the tent felt warmer than earlier, almost as if something was blocking the outside breeze. I listened, holding myself still, trying to sense anything beyond the thin nylon walls. At first there was nothing. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate sound, like someone dragging their foot lightly through loose pine needles. It wasn't fast enough to be an animal. It wasn't cautious enough to be the wind. I lay there frozen, counting each faint crunch as it moved behind my tent, then to the side, then toward the path I'd come from. I never heard footsteps leaving, only the sound fading, as if whatever made it was waiting just beyond the tree line. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside expecting to see prints or disturbed ground, but everything looked untouched. Too untouched. Even the pine litter I'd scuffed while setting up camp the previous evening looked neat again. That unnatural order made my skin crawl. I packed my things quickly and decided to cut the trek short, heading back the way I came. But after hiking for more than 2 hours, I realized something was wrong. The landscape didn't match what I remembered. The trail looked like it had subtly shifted direction, as if someone had erased the original path overnight and drawn a new one that mimicked the old one imperfectly. I pulled out my map repeatedly, convinced I was confusing myself, but the more I tried to align the details, the more it became obvious that something wasn't right. I tried to rationalize it. Trails get rerouted. Weather changes terrain. Memory shifts small things. But the tension in my stomach kept tightening, and at a certain point instinct began to override logic. I decided to leave the trail entirely and push west toward a known service road. It should have been only a couple miles away, but the forest felt different off the trail, as if it had settled itself into patterns meant to redirect me. Fallen logs were arranged in long diagonals that forced me to zigzag around them. Underbrush thickened in seemingly targeted sections, funneling me toward areas that grew darker and narrower. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone following, but every time I stopped the forest looked still and empty. That emptiness only made everything worse. By late afternoon my legs were trembling from exhaustion, and I finally reached the edge of a long slope leading down toward what appeared to be another clearing. I thought it might be my best chance at reorienting myself, so I started descending. But halfway down, I noticed the clearing wasn't natural. The trees formed a near-perfect circle, and in the center was something that made my entire body go rigid. A tent. Old, sun-bleached, partially collapsed, with a broken pole sticking out like a snapped bone. I knew instantly it wasn't from any modern brand. It looked like it had been abandoned decades ago. At first I thought maybe I could find supplies or clues inside, something that could help me. But as I got closer, I saw deep grooves in the dirt around it. They weren't footprints. They were drag marks, long, smooth, and circling the tent in wide loops, the same slow pattern I'd heard the night before. The air around that clearing felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my lungs. I didn't go inside the tent. I didn't touch anything. I backed away slowly, my heartbeat pounding so loud I could feel it echo through my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to move, but I forced myself not to run because I could sense something waiting for me to panic. When I reached the treeline again, I turned west and didn't look back. I pushed through brush, climbed over rock, scraped my legs raw on sharp branches, anything to get as far from that circle as possible. I didn't stop until the forest around me began to thin. Eventually I stumbled onto the service road, just as the last light drained from the sky. I collapsed onto the gravel, overwhelmed by the feeling of being somewhere real again, somewhere defined by human hands and not whatever I had wandered into. I followed the road for miles in the dark until a ranger truck finally approached. The ranger rolled down the window and asked if I was all right. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could speak I saw something in the reflection of his headlights behind me. The drag marks, faint, irregular, leading out of the forest onto the road, as if something had followed me until the moment the truck appeared. They were too fresh to be old, too deep to be accidental, and they trailed into darkness where the trees pressed together like a mouth closing. I never went back to the San Juan forest, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that slow circling pattern in my memory, as if it's pacing just outside the edges of wherever I am. And each time I hear it, I can't help wondering if I really escaped, or if the forest is still waiting for the moment I step back into wilderness, where no one can hear me if something decides to drag me away. The day it happened started with a sky so clear it looked scraped clean. I'd flown into Washington several days earlier, planning a solo trek along a remote section of the Olympic Peninsula. It wasn't part of the main tourist routes. It was the kind of place seasoned hikers whispered about, the kind you only hear of through ranger bulletin boards or old trip reports buried on local forums. What pulled me toward it wasn't the scenery, though. It was the promise of long miles without seeing a single soul. At least that was what I thought I wanted. That kind of loneliness can feel liberating until it changes tone, until it turns into something else entirely. The trail started off soft, edged by ferns and towering Sitka spruce, their trunks thick and furrowed like ancient pillars supporting a living roof. The air smelled damp and cool, carrying the constant hush of distant water. Everything felt pristine, untouched. My boots sank into moss so thick it felt like stepping into carpet. I remember thinking how quiet it was. Even the birds seemed subdued, their sounds muffled by the dense forest layers. I didn't recognize it at the time, but the silence wasn't natural. It was the kind that waits, the kind that listens. A few miles in, I crossed an old wooden bridge stretched over a shallow stream. The boards were slick, darkened by constant moisture. Halfway across, my foot slipped slightly, and when I looked down, I saw deep gouges in the wood. Not claw marks, not blade marks. Long, uneven scrapes like something heavy had been dragged across it repeatedly. The middle of the bridge sagged more than the edges, and the grain of the wood was warped in a strange bowing pattern. I told myself it was from storms, fallen branches, maybe equipment being hauled long ago. But something about the grooves made me uneasy. They weren't weathered evenly. They were fresh at the center, older at the edges. Something had used that bridge recently, something that didn't care about walking. I kept going, pushing deeper into the forest. After a couple more hours, the undergrowth thinned enough for me to climb onto a ridge overlooking a valley. Down below, I saw a campsite. Not a maintained one. Something old. A collapsed canvas tent, half eaten by moss. A metal pot laying upside down, rusted through. A red jacket draped across a stump, bleached nearly pink by sun and rain. I scanned the clearing, trying to decide whether to go down or not. There was no path leading to it. No recent tracks. It looked abandoned for years. Still, some part of me wanted to check in case someone had left a message or gear. But the longer I stared, the more I felt like the clearing itself was wrong. The trees surrounding it seemed bent inward slightly, like they were leaning in to observe. I told myself it was an optical illusion from the ridge, but the uneasiness stayed with me as I moved on. The trail narrowed, weaving through tight clusters of cedar. The sky darkened, even though it wasn't late. The tree canopy was thick enough to dim the light to an eerie half-shadow. My breathing grew louder in my ears, mixing with the steady thump of my heartbeat. That was when I heard it for the first time. A faint, irregular thud somewhere behind me. Not footsteps. More like a dull impact against soft ground. A heavy weight shifting. I stopped moving. The sound stopped too. I waited, counting seconds, but the silence pressed back, suffocating in its completeness. I tried to laugh it off internally, telling myself it was a branch falling, maybe an animal. But the rhythm of it had matched my pace too well. I walked faster after that. Not running, just quicker strides, trying to stay calm. Miles passed without another sound, and I managed to settle into a rhythm again. The forest opened into a long marshy flatland. Wooden planks had been laid across parts of it years ago, judging by the rot. Some sections had completely collapsed, leaving muddy patches filled with dark, stagnant water. As I stepped onto one of the remaining boards, it shifted under my weight. I froze, arms out to steady myself. That was when I noticed the footprints ahead. Boot prints. Large ones. Deeply pressed into the boards. The stride length was long, far longer than mine, but something about them made my stomach twist. They weren't consistent. Some were light, others were punched into the wood with a force that didn't make sense for a human walker. And the deepest ones had warped the old planks downward, splitting them along the grain. I crouched to inspect one, running my fingers near the edge. The split was clean and fresh, as if it had happened not long before I arrived. The mud beneath the board was still disturbed. My pulse started to climb. I checked the tree line repeatedly. The forest was motionless, almost staged. I continued along the marsh, stepping carefully. Each time I shifted my weight, I felt the planks bow slightly. I moved as quietly as possible, listening for anything out of place. For a few minutes, everything remained still. Then, from somewhere behind the marsh, I heard another dull thud. Slow, measured, heavy. I resisted the urge to turn around quickly, afraid that sudden movement might draw attention. I instead kept walking, keeping my breath shallow. When I finally reached solid ground again, I turned back. The marsh was empty. The planks sat still. But one detail made my skin crawl. A single board near the center had sunk lower than before, angling downward like something had put weight on it. I pushed deeper into the forest, determined to reach the next ridge where my map showed a small emergency shelter. The elevation rose sharply, forcing me to climb with my hands at points. The trees grew more spaced out, letting in weak afternoon light. I felt slightly better until I found the first sign that something was terribly wrong. Not cut, pulled apart. I felt panic surge in my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving. I couldn't afford to freeze. As I climbed the final slope toward the ridge, the forest went still again. No wind, no birds, no insects. The world felt paused. That was when I heard it. The branches overhead were thick enough to hide anything in the shadows between them. I didn't look up. I didn't want to see. Instead, I kept walking, step after controlled step. When I reached the ridge, I saw the small emergency shelter exactly where the map promised. A square wooden structure with a slanted roof and a heavy door. Relief hit me hard enough to make my knees weak. I hurried toward it, grabbing the door handle. It resisted for a second before swinging open. The interior smelled like damp wood and dust. A metal bench sat in the corner, an old first aid kit mounted on the wall. But what made my breath stop was the floor. Deep scratches ran across it in chaotic patterns, cutting into the wood. Some overlapped, some ran in looping arcs. They weren't from boots or equipment. They were too sporadic, too forceful. The deepest cuts reached nearly a quarter-inch into the planks. I stepped back outside, heart pounding. The ridge was quiet, too quiet. The trees stood motionless in every direction. I could feel eyes on me even though I saw nothing. I knew staying in the shelter would trap me if anything came. I turned east, toward the direction of the main trail several miles away. I moved fast, almost running, trying to ignore the throbbing in my legs. Every few minutes I heard something behind me. Branches shifting, soft thumps, weight settling on different parts of the forest floor. Always steady, always measured. Never close enough to see, but close enough. I always thought the Rocky Mountains felt safest in late autumn, when most tourists had already gone home and the air carried that crisp, metallic smell that makes every breath feel cleaner. That was why I chose that week, that trail, and that route along the less traveled eastern side of the range. I wanted quiet. I wanted the kind of solitude that lets your thoughts untangle themselves. But the thing about solitude is that it can flip on you without warning. One moment it feels like freedom. The next it feels like being observed by something you can't locate. And by the time you realize the shift, it's already too late. The day began with pale sunlight filtering through thin clouds, the kind that promise cold, but not storms. I parked my car near a small unmarked turnout and started on a narrow trail that wound through low shrubs and scattered boulders. The ground was damp from overnight frost, and each step made a soft crunching sound that felt too loud in the still air. The forest around me was quiet in a way that made me keep pausing, just to confirm I wasn't imagining it. No wind, no bird calls, no distant animal movement, just the crackle of my steps and the faint rasp of my pack straps shifting against my shoulders. Several miles in, the trail intersected with a creek. The water was shallow and moved slowly over pale stones, but on the opposite bank I noticed something immediately. A set of footprints, deep boot prints, recent. They crossed the creek at a diagonal, the sizing a little larger than my own boots. But what caught my attention wasn't the size, it was the spacing. The prints were far apart, too far for a normal stride unless the person had been moving quickly or hauling something heavy. The shape of them also looked strange, the heel indent sharper than the toe, like the weight fell backward rather than forward. I crouched and touched the edge of one print. The mud was still soft. Whatever made them had passed through not long before me. At first that didn't bother me. People use unofficial trails all the time. What unsettled me was the direction the tracks led. They weren't following the trail. They headed straight into a dense cluster of pines where the branches grew so tightly interwoven that even light struggled to get through. I stared at that thicket for a while, feeling the cold air tighten around me. The forest looked still, but something about that stillness made my fingers twitch. I backed away slowly and kept to the marked path. The trail climbed steeply after that, winding along the side of a ridge where the drop-off grew sharper with each switchback. The forest thinned, replaced by rocky slopes and tall grasses that rustled only when I disturbed them. I kept thinking about those prints, about the stride length, about the direction. I tried to shake it, but the silence of the trail made my mind replay every small detail in loops. Around midday, I reached a shelf of stone that overlooked a wide basin. The view should have comforted me. Instead, something about that open space made my stomach tighten. Down below, I spotted another set of disturbances in the grass. Not prints, drag marks. Long, shallow, irregular lines across the slope as if someone had pulled something heavy and unwieldy through the field. The lines ran in erratic paths, sometimes straight, sometimes weaving, but they all converged into a stand of dark firs at the far end of the basin. The pattern of them made my skin prickle, too chaotic to be equipment, too deliberate to be animals. I scanned the basin for any sign of movement. Nothing, just a muted stillness that felt heavier now. I considered turning back then. Something deep in my instincts pushed for it. But the trail was a loop, and I convinced myself the faster option was to push forward rather than retrace several hours. I told myself I was being paranoid. People drag logs sometimes. Hunter's Hall game. Tracks can distort in grass. I fed myself every rational explanation I could think of, but none of them sat right. An hour later, the trail dipped into the basin and crossed the field where I had seen the drag marks. Walking among them felt worse up close. The grass in the disturbed lines wasn't bent the way it should be if something had been pulled. It was flattened cleanly, almost pressed into the soil. And the soil beneath was disturbed in shallow curves that reminded me of someone pulling something uneven with determined force. I didn't linger. I walked faster than before, glancing repeatedly toward the tree-line where the marks disappeared. The trees looked motionless, their trunks dark and close together, forming a wall of shadow that seemed to swallow the space behind them. As the trail turned west, I found the first real sign that something wasn't right. A flashlight, half buried beneath a pile of needles. The casing was cracked, one end bent inward. I picked it up, and the plastic felt strangely warm despite the cold air. A few feet away I saw a torn backpack strap lying limp across a rock. No bag, just the strap, frayed at one end as if pulled apart. I felt my heartbeat move into my throat. This was no longer just an odd trail. Something had happened here. I kept moving because stopping felt dangerous. The forest closed in again, denser than before. The trees grew taller, darker, their branches crowding overhead until the sky narrowed into a thin gray strip. The air smelled faintly metallic, like the inside of a tool shed. My footsteps seemed too loud. Every few minutes I stopped to listen. That was when I first heard it. A soft, deliberate crunch of pine needles somewhere behind me. I froze. My breath held itself. The forest returned to silence. I waited, counting seconds. 30, 40, still nothing. I took a step forward. The sound followed. Not immediately, not loudly, just a faint shift of weight, like something stepping slowly, methodically, testing each footfall. The distance felt impossible to judge. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, a deer, a stray elk, but the rhythm was wrong. It matched my pace too precisely. Whenever I sped up, the sound did too. When I slowed, it lagged by only a moment, like something adjusting its movements to mine. I didn't turn around. I don't know why. Some instinct deeper than reason whispered that looking back was exactly what I shouldn't do. Instead, I kept walking carefully, steadily, focusing on every breath. The sound trailed me for another 10 minutes before fading again. Not stopping, just falling back as if keeping distance. By late afternoon, I reached another ridge. My legs shook from tension more than fatigue. At the ridge's edge, I found something that hollowed me out. Another campsite, a modern one this time. A tent collapsed inward, one pole snapped in half. A jacket half buried under leaves. A metal cup flattened. Everything looked abandoned in a hurry. No blood. No signs of animal attack. Just the eerie imprint of panic, like the shape of fear left behind. I crouched near the tent. The ground beneath was disturbed, dragged in long, uneven swaths. But not outward. Inward. As if something had pulled everything toward the tent, not away from it. The soil was marked by deep, narrow channels that reminded me of someone bracing heels against the ground while being dragged. The mark stopped abruptly a few feet from the tent entrance. The silence around that clearing felt suffocating. I backed away slowly. My throat felt tight. The trees seemed to lean inward the way they do in moments when paranoia spikes, except this didn't feel. I still remember the quiet of that morning, the kind of quiet that makes you hesitate before taking your next breath, as if the air itself is warning you to tread lightly. I was deep within the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana, a place I had always considered one of the few corners of the country where real solitude still survived. I had gone out there for a long weekend, hoping to disconnect and reset. Instead, I ended up carrying a memory I still can't shake no matter how many miles I hike, or how many nights I spend in a well-lit house trying to convince myself it wasn't as bad as it felt. But the truth is, it was worse. Much worse. The trail was one I had done before, a narrow spine of dirt and scattered rock that wound between old pines and thin stretches of meadow. The air smelled cold, even though summer wasn't quite over. My boots were damp from the grass, and every time the wind moved across the ridge, it felt like it was reminding me how far I was from anyone else. I had seen only one other vehicle at the trailhead, an old red Ford with a cracked windshield and a bumper held on with wire. I assumed it belonged to another hiker, or maybe someone camping a bit farther in. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I wish I had. By late afternoon, the light had turned that soft gold you only get in the mountains. I reached a clearing above a narrow valley and decided to set up camp before the temperature really dropped. My tent went up easily, the way it does when you've done it enough times that your hands know the motions before you think them through. I ate, I rested, I listened to the forest shift from day to night. It was peaceful in a way that made me feel small but steady, the kind of peace that usually helps me sleep. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. Sometime past midnight, I woke to a noise I couldn't immediately place. It wasn't an animal, or at least not one I recognized. It was a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy moving through brush but trying to stay quiet. My head cleared quickly, adrenaline cutting through the fog of sleep. I held my breath, listening, waiting. The sound stopped. Then it started again, a few feet closer, and then closer still. I felt the hair on my arms lift one by one. I always keep a small flashlight beside me. I grabbed it, but I didn't turn it on. Instead, I stayed still, hoping whatever was out there would lose interest. But then I heard a different noise. A soft hiss of breath. Human. Too close. Far too close. I finally clicked the light on, and the beam cut through the darkness, catching nothing but trees and empty air. But the noise stopped instantly, like whoever was making it had frozen the second the light appeared. I turned the beam left, then right, sweeping slowly. Nothing. Just the growing ache in my chest as I realized how alone I really was. The sound didn't come back that night, but I didn't sleep again either. By morning, I tried to convince myself it had been an animal after all. Maybe a deer with an odd gait, or something injured. I packed up quickly, trying to ignore the uneasy thud in my stomach. I kept telling myself that daylight fixed everything. I even laughed at my own fear for a moment. But as I folded the tent, I noticed something in the dirt near where my head had been while I slept. A footprint. Not boot tread. A barefoot print. Long, narrow, and deep enough to show whoever made it had stood there for a while. I began moving down the trail faster than usual, pushing through switchbacks, scanning the woods more than I watched my footing. By noon, the sun was bright and the heat gave me a thin sheen of sweat, but the cold feeling in my spine never went away. Around an hour later, I reached a section of trail that dipped into a narrow gorge where the trees grew tight and the air felt trapped. I kept walking, trying to maintain rhythm, when I noticed something strange on the ground ahead. A strip of fabric. Blue. Torn. Fresh. I crouched and picked it up. It was part of a t-shirt sleeve, and not far from it, a dry smear of dirt disturbed by something dragged across it. I felt that same dragging sound return in my memory, clear as if it were happening again. My chest tightened. I stuffed the fabric in my pocket without thinking and kept moving quicker now, trying to reach an open area where I could see more than a few feet in any direction. But the trail narrowed again, like the woods wanted to swallow it. Then, just before a bend, I saw another bare footprint in the dust, followed by another, both heading the same direction as me. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe deeply. I didn't dare look behind me. I just moved. The moment I rounded the bend, I froze. A shape crouched near a fallen log. Human. Shirtless. Hair long and matted. Back turned toward me. He wasn't moving. Not at first. I stared, trying to understand what I was seeing, until his shoulders rose with a slow inhale. Then he turned his head just enough for me to see his cheek, and the dirt smeared across it. His eyes were open, unfocused, staring at something on the ground I couldn't see. My legs carried me backward before I could think. I didn't make a sound, but somehow he knew. His head twitched. Then he shifted like he was about to stand. I ran. Branches slapped my arms. Rocks slid under my boots. I didn't care. I just ran until the trail widened into sunlight again, and the wind returned. I ran until I saw the parking area through the trees. And when I burst out between the pines, I saw only one vehicle waiting at the trailhead. The old red Ford. Its door was open, and on the passenger seat, folded neatly, was a blue t-shirt missing a sleeve. I haven't been back to Montana since, and the worst part isn't the memory of the man, or the thought of how long he might have been watching me. The worst part is the truth I try not to think about. That torn fabric in my pocket was new, clean, almost untouched. Too new to belong to him. And when I got home and checked that pocket again, it was gone. There is a moment I keep replaying in my head. A moment I didn't understand when it happened, but now sits in my memory like a warning I ignored too late. It was the moment I stepped off the last patch of maintained trail in the Ouachita National Forest and felt the ground soften beneath my boots. I remember thinking it was just damp soil from the previous night's rain, but it felt like something else. Like the earth didn't want to hold my weight. Like it was telling me to turn around. I should have listened. I had planned a 2-day solo loop, something quiet and uncomplicated, nothing more than a chance to clear my head after months of non-stop work. I picked a stretch of forest in western Arkansas where the trails were used but not crowded, where the tree line was dense and the ridge lines felt endless. I've hiked alone for years, and I've always believed the woods had a way of calming a person if you treated them with respect. But that weekend, the woods didn't feel calming. They felt watchful. The first few hours were peaceful enough. Crisp air, scattered birdsong, the scent of cedar and wet leaves. I followed the markers without thinking, letting my muscles fall into the familiar rhythm of steady movement. It wasn't until midday, when the clouds dimmed the sunlight and the forest took on a muted, gray-green tone, that I noticed something unusual. A faint path cutting away from the main trail, almost invisible unless you were standing right beside it. It was narrow, the kind of thing that might have been created by animals, or by someone who didn't want others to find where they were going. Normally, I ignore unmarked paths. But something about this one tugged at my attention. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe boredom, maybe the illusion of adventure. Or maybe, and I hate admitting this, I followed it because I felt like someone had walked down it recently, and I wanted to know who. The further I went, the quieter everything became. Not silent in the dramatic sense, just unnervingly muffled, like the forest was absorbing sound instead of reflecting it. My footsteps felt too loud. My breathing felt too sharp. The trees grew close enough that branches brushed my shoulders as I squeezed between them, and the ground sloped in a way that made me brace my steps more carefully. After 10 minutes, I recognized I had gone far enough off trail that turning around was smarter than continuing. I had just started to pivot back when I saw the first piece of fabric. It hung on a low branch, torn clean along the edge, like it had been snagged by someone moving fast. It was gray, maybe part of a hoodie, worn and dirty but definitely human-made. I took a moment to examine it, telling myself it was probably from a lost hiker or a hunter who'd brushed too close to the branches. But the fabric wasn't faded like it had been out there long. It was damp from the rain but not weathered. Someone had passed through recently. I turned back toward the main trail, but after a few steps, I noticed something that made the air around me feel instantly colder. There were footprints. Not boot prints, shoe prints. Light, shallow, spaced unevenly, like someone had been walking with a limp or shifting direction repeatedly. And they weren't headed toward the main trail. They led deeper into the woods. I should have left. Everyone says that when hearing a story like this, why didn't you just turn around? Why didn't you get out while you could? Believe me, I ask myself the same questions. But there was something about those footprints, something desperate in the way they twisted and doubled back, that made me think someone might actually be in trouble. I followed them. The forest closed in tighter, branches knitting overhead until the light dimmed enough I had to pull out my flashlight. The beam carved through the gray and revealed another scrap of fabric, then another. Bits of thread, a shoe print scuffed into damp soil. And then abruptly, the path ended at a steep drop-off overlooking a rocky drainage. The kind of place someone could fall and easily break something. My chest tightened when I saw what was on the ground at the edge of the drop. A phone. Screen cracked, frame dented, back smeared with dirt. I picked it up out of instinct, but the battery was dead. My pulse quickened. Maybe someone really had fallen. Maybe they were down there right now, hurt and unable to climb out. I crouched at the edge, angling my flashlight down into the ravine. Nothing. Just rocks, mud, broken branches, and a shallow trickle of water. But then I heard it. A sharp, sudden clatter of stone somewhere behind me. I jerked upright, spinning with the flashlight raised. The beam cut across the trees, slicing through shadows, revealing nothing but thick undergrowth. But the noise had been close. Much too close. My instincts kicked in immediately. The same instincts that have saved me more than once in the backcountry. I wasn't alone. I began walking back toward the main trail, not quite running, but moving with a speed born from something deep and primal. Every few steps, I looked behind me, catching glimpses of shifting branches and dark spaces between trunks. The silence had changed again. It wasn't muffled now. It was tense, charged, like the woods were holding their breath alongside me. Then I noticed something that made every part of me lock in place. There were new footprints on top of mine. Not beside them. Not intersecting them. On top of them. Fresh. Someone had been behind me. Close enough to step exactly where I had stepped only minutes before. I moved faster. The forest grew brighter as I neared the main trail, sunlight filtering through again, promising safety that felt both close and impossibly far. I was maybe 30 yards from the clearing when another sound stopped me cold. It wasn't loud, just a soft exhale carried faintly on the wind. Human. Close. I didn't turn. I didn't think. I just ran. When I burst back onto the real trail, the relief was so intense it almost made my legs buckle. But I didn't stop moving until I reached the parking area. Only one vehicle was there besides mine. An old SUV with mud splashed up the sides and a map tucked awkwardly against the windshield. The driver's door was shut, the windows tinted too dark to see inside. I felt eyes on me, but I didn't look. I drove away without catching my breath. It wasn't until later that night, when I finally forced myself to empty my pockets, that I realized something else had changed. The torn piece of gray fabric I had picked up earlier wasn't there anymore. I know I put it in my pocket. I know I felt it there for the next hour. But when I reached home and went to set it on the counter, it was gone. Which means someone took it. And the only time they could have taken it was while I was still in the forest, still following footprints that weren't nearly as old as I wanted to believe. The day it happened started out so normal that I still can't reconcile how quickly everything shifted. I remember the color of the sky more clearly than anything else. It was a pale, dusted blue, the kind that makes the world feel bigger than usual. I had driven into the Gila National Forest in New Mexico for a long, quiet hike, something I'd been craving after weeks of noise, deadlines, and endless screens. I just wanted trees, cold morning air, and the steady rhythm of my boots on dirt. I didn't want company. I didn't expect any. The forest out there is huge, and even on popular weekends, you might go the whole day without seeing another person. Or at least without seeing one who wants to be seen. I parked at a small pull-off where the gravel was scattered thin and pale. Only one other vehicle sat there, a dusty silver sedan with all four windows rolled up and a sunshade pressed awkwardly against the windshield. No stickers, no gear, nothing that suggested who it belonged to. It struck me as odd, but not alarming. Plenty of hikers carry minimal equipment. I strapped on my pack and stepped into the trees. The forest was perfect in that early light. Smells of juniper and sun-warmed pine needles drifted upward as the trail carried me into gentle elevation. I felt myself easing into it, slipping into that familiar calm that only comes when you're far from anything manufactured. I walked for about 2 hours before the trail forked near an old fire road. My plan was to take the left path, loop around the ridge, and work my way back by late afternoon. But I never made it to the ridge. Just before the fork, something caught my eye. A backpack, off-trail, half hidden beneath a cluster of prickly pear. It wasn't torn or scattered, just sitting there like someone had placed it down intentionally. A black pack, fairly new, with a red carabiner clipped to the strap and a faint dusting of dirt along the bottom. I called out instinctively, even though I knew I wouldn't get a response. My voice felt small in the stillness. Nothing stirred. I stepped closer and noticed the zipper was open just enough to show the inner lining. Not ripped open, not rummaged through by animals, just unzipped, as if someone had opened it and been interrupted. I should have left it alone, but curiosity has a way of blinding you to common sense. I checked inside, expecting maybe a map or a water bottle. Instead, I found only a single item. A shoe. Just one. A dirty running shoe with the laces tied neatly, placed carefully inside the pack as if it belonged there. Something about that bothered me enough that I stood there longer than I should have. The forest felt off. Not wrong exactly, just watchful. I put the shoe back the way I found it, zipped the pack, and left it where it was. I moved faster after that. The trail beyond the fork was narrower than I remembered from the map. Brush scratched my legs, and at times I had to hold branches aside to keep them from snapping back into my face. After maybe 15 minutes, I realized the quiet had changed. It wasn't empty like before. It was heavy, like something was absorbing the sound instead of letting it drift. Then I saw the footprints, light impressions in the dust. Human, narrow, barefoot. I froze. I've seen barefoot hikers before, but not out here, not miles into rough terrain. And definitely not making tracks that moved both ahead of me and behind me. I looked carefully. The prints overlapped my own in places, pressed cleanly atop them. Someone had been following me. My breathing changed instantly, becoming shallow despite my attempts to slow it. I turned around and scanned the trees. Nothing. No movement. No sound. But I suddenly felt exposed in a way I can't fully describe, as if eyes were on me from multiple angles at once. I forced myself forward. The trail sloped downhill into a shaded ravine where light filtered through the branches in thin streaks. Halfway down, something glinted beside the trail. A watch. A simple metal watch lying face up on the rocks. Still ticking. still warm from sun or skin, I couldn't tell which. I didn't touch it. I just moved. At the bottom of the ravine, the air felt cooler, damp, almost metallic. I followed the curve of the trail until I reached a point where the brush opened slightly, revealing a narrow, shallow creek. And there, on the opposite bank, stood the owner of the footprints. I didn't hear him approach. I didn't hear anything at all. He stood barefoot, clothes torn and dirty, face streaked with dried mud as if he had pressed his palms against it repeatedly. His posture wasn't threatening, just wrong. Tilted slightly forward, head low, shoulders rigid. Like he had been standing there for hours waiting for something to happen. I didn't move. My heart pounded against my ribs, so hard I thought it might bruise. The man lifted his head slowly, and I saw his eyes. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me. I turned before I could stop myself, scanning the trees behind me, expecting to see someone else. But the forest was empty. When I looked back at him, he was gone. Just gone. No splash in the creek. No branches shifting. No running footsteps. It was as if he had been pulled backward into the trees without a sound. I didn't think. I just ran. Branches tore at my arms. Rocks slid under my boots. The trail became a blur of shadow and sunlight. I don't know how long I ran, but at some point, the trees thinned and the air brightened. I burst out onto the fire road near the fork, breath ragged, legs shaking. I reached the trailhead more by instinct than memory. The silver sedan was still there, but something had changed. The sunshade was gone. The driver's door was open half an inch, and leaning upright against the rear tire was the same backpack I had found off-trail. Zipper closed, red carabiner catching the sunlight. I didn't check inside. I didn't look around. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove without stopping until I reached town. That night, long after I should have been asleep, a thought hit me so hard it made my stomach twist. When I first saw the barefoot man, he wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me. Not because he saw someone else, but because he heard someone else behind me before I did. And I still don't know who that was, or why neither of them wanted to be seen at the same time. I had been hiking for hours along the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania, alone, savoring the solitude that only a midweek trail can provide. The early morning fog clung to the trees, so thick it was almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I remember the chill pressing against my skin, how the dampness soaked my jacket and made every step heavier. I told myself it was just the weather, just another hike, nothing more. But even as I said it, a subtle unease had begun to grow in the back of my mind, one that I tried and failed to ignore. The trail twisted sharply between dense pines and rocky outcrops, forcing me to slow my pace. I noticed strange patterns in the mud, not footprints, not exactly, but deep gouges that looked like something large had scraped along the ground. I assumed it was fallen branches or perhaps erosion, though the sharpness of the marks didn't feel natural. I studied them carefully, tracing the lines with my eyes, and then I heard the faintest snapping sound, like a twig bending beneath a foot. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest, every instinct screaming that I was being watched. But when I lifted my eyes, the forest appeared untouched, silent, the fog swallowing every detail beyond 10 feet. I pressed forward, telling myself it was paranoia. The forest has a way of playing tricks on the mind, shadows forming shapes in the fog that aren't there. Still, the unease persisted, tightening my chest. By mid-morning, the trail led to a narrow ridge overlooking a steep slope. The fog had thinned slightly, revealing a small clearing below where the sunlight managed to break through the tree canopy. I caught a glimpse of something that made my stomach turn, a campsite. Not maintained or marked on any map, no trail led directly to it. Just a small tent, its fabric sagging, a single chair overturned, and a pair of boots set neatly outside. They weren't moving. They weren't anything. They were simply there, like someone had left in a hurry and then vanished. I debated going down to investigate. Curiosity clawed at me, but every instinct screamed to turn back. I decided to skirt around the clearing, keeping my distance. As I did, I noticed more marks in the soil, small divots forming a chaotic trail into the trees beyond the clearing. My skin prickled. They weren't deep enough for an adult to make with full weight, but they weren't shallow enough for a child. Something had moved quickly through that spot, leaving only subtle evidence. I looked around, half expecting to see someone stepping carefully between the trees, watching me. Nothing moved. Not a leaf stirred. Not a bird called. Only the wind whispered softly through the pines. I continued along the ridge, trying to keep a calm rhythm, but the forest had changed. The fog seemed thicker again, reducing visibility to nearly nothing. I began to notice sounds out of place. A faint rustle, a subtle shift of weight, the barely audible creak of something heavy brushing against brush. I turned abruptly. Nothing, but the impression of movement persisted. Every step forward felt like a risk, like each footfall could trigger an unseen presence to reveal itself. My anxiety built with each passing minute, my pace quickening despite the rocky path beneath my boots. Hours passed in a haze of mist and muted colors. The trail sloped downward, leading me toward a creek I recognized from the map. I approached cautiously, the sound of running water a faint comfort. And then I saw it, more footprints. These were deliberate, precise, human, but unfamiliar. They followed the creek for a short stretch before disappearing into the forest. I traced them with my eyes, noting how some were half-formed, dragging in the mud, leaving only faint impressions. My chest tightened. Someone had been here recently, moving through this exact area. Not lost, not wandering, following a purpose. I debated whether to turn back entirely. Logic told me to leave, to call it a day, but something rooted me to the spot. Maybe I wanted to know who had passed this way. Maybe I wanted to prove I wasn't afraid. I followed the footprints. They led to a bend in the creek where the forest closed in so tightly the light barely penetrated. And then I heard it, a sound so soft I thought I had imagined it, but my body knew otherwise. A shallow exhale. Close. Intentional. Human. My head whipped in every direction. The forest swallowed the fog around me, making shadows dance in unnatural patterns. Nothing moved, yet the sensation of being observed was undeniable. I took a step forward. Another exhale. From the left? Behind me? I couldn't tell. My pulse raced. My hands shook. Every rational explanation for the sound dissolved into fear. I started to move faster, then faster still, compelled by an instinct I couldn't name. The trail curved sharply, and I stumbled over exposed roots, barely catching myself. Then I saw it. A figure crouched low, partially hidden in the brush. Barely noticeable at first, blending with shadows and fog. Human. Thin, gaunt, wearing tattered clothing, hair tangled and dark. Its face turned slowly, revealing eyes that were wide and unblinking. And then impossibly it was gone. In a blink. No step, no rustle, no sound. Just gone. I ran. I didn't stop. The forest became a blur. Twigs slapped my arms. Rocks slid beneath my boots. Branches clawed at my face. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it. The presence, relentless and patient, trailing me at a distance I couldn't measure. Every step I took, it seemed closer, yet when I dared to glance over my shoulder, there was nothing. The trail eventually widened, sunlight breaking through more consistently. Relief should have settled over me, but the tension didn't ease. When I reached the parking area, the lot was empty except for my car. Nothing else. No signs of anyone else. The only evidence of my terror was the sweat-soaked jacket and mud-streaked boots I brought back from the trail. Later, back at home, I examined my camera. I had taken a few photos along the ridge. Most were normal, but one captured a figure partially obscured by fog, standing far in the distance near the creek. Barely discernible, yet unmistakably human. Its posture was rigid. Its eyes seemed to stare directly into the lens. I didn't notice it when I took the photo. I still don't understand how long it had been there. The memory haunts me because I know one thing for certain. I was not alone in that forest. And whatever was out there did not want to be found. It waited, observed, and moved with a patience I have never forgotten. I sometimes wonder if it still exists, lurking quietly in that same area, waiting for someone else foolish enough to follow footprints into the fog. I will never hike that section again. But the forest has a way of returning in dreams. Sometimes I wake up, hear the faintest exhale behind me, and remember that I wasn't just lost in the fog. I was being watched. And I am convinced that whatever was out there still is.